Michael, we are ready to go.
Good morning. Buenos días a todos y a todas. Thank you so much for joining us for a discussion on the deeply troubling situation in Nicaragua. In recent weeks, Daniel Ortega, who has been Nicaragua's president since 2007, and of course before that, revolutionary leader in the 1980s, has carried out a relentless and unprecedented wave of repression in the country. He's targeted leading opposition figures and virtually all pre-presidential candidates in advance of the November 7th presidential election. To date, 6 presidential hopefuls have been detained. Those who have been persecuted are accused of violating a highly dubious treason law passed late last year, as well as crimes committed during the 2018 anti-government protests that faced fierce reprisals from security officials, resulting in more than 300 deaths. Many of those detained are familiar and in fact have been involved in dialogue programs on Nicaragua for many years. Of the 14 members of an inter-American dialogue organized task force focusing on supporting a democratic transition in Nicaragua, 9 are currently detained. In what the US State Department has characterized as a, quote, campaign of terror, which is ongoing as we meet this morning, the authoritarian regime has essentially sought to achieve absolute power and eliminate any potential challenge to the iron-fisted rule of Ortega and his wife and Vice President Rosario Murillo. This brazen crackdown on democracy, which has instilled widespread fear in Nicaraguan society, has drawn considerable outrage and condemnation in the international community, including most governments and human rights organizations. We saw a resolution in the Organization of American States on June 15th, and the European Union, and most recently, sanctions and policy announcement made by the European Parliament. The US government has issued a number of very forceful denunciations at the highest levels, both in the Biden administration as well as the US Congress, and has applied sanctions to regime officials. Additional options and instruments to pressure the regime are being explored. To date, however, despite the outrage and the strong pressure, Ortega has dug in and has been able to resist and remains defiant and undeterred. The deteriorating conditions have led hundreds to leave Nicaragua every day, some crossing borders heading north en route to the United States, while others moving south to Costa Rica and to Panama. Against this profoundly disturbing backdrop, we want to examine this morning a number of questions, including what is the current state of play in Nicaragua? What does Ortega hope to achieve with this crackdown? What is his game plan? Why is the repression intensifying now? What are the possible leverage points to pressure the regime to change its behavior and to pull back? What additional steps should be taken? What are the implications of the grave situation for the November 7th election? Is it still possible to organize a reasonably free and fair vote a few months ahead of the election? And to what extent is the Nicaraguan crisis contributing to an even more acute migration crisis in Central America? So we also want to take a wider perspective on this country's crisis and look at it within the context of Central America and also US policy towards Central America. To shed much needed light on these questions, we're fortunate to have with us 3 excellent, well-known and highly respected speakers, deeply committed to democracy in Nicaragua. Let me introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. First, I want to welcome a good friend, Carlos Fernando Chamorro, the award-winning brave journalist and director of Confidencial, which is an online newspaper of investigative journalism, and who has been for many years and continues to be a target of persecution and who is in fact now in exile in Costa Rica, where he joins us this morning. As we know, Carlos Fernando's sister and pre-presidential candidate, Cristiana Chamorro, is currently being detained. After Carlos Fernando, we will hear from President Laura Chinchilla, former president of Costa Rica and the Inter-American Dialogue's co-chair, who has been extremely outspoken and appropriately passionate in response to Ortega's brutal crackdown and has a very valuable perspective on the Nicaraguan crisis. President Chinchilla joins us this morning from New York, and we're really very, very pleased to welcome her and thank her so much for participating. And finally, we are joined by my colleague, Manuel Orozco, who currently directs the Center of Migration and Economic Stabilization at Creative Associates International, and is also a senior fellow at the Dialogue. During his time at the Dialogue, Manuel organized and directed the task force on Nicaragua that I alluded to earlier on, and has led many of the dialogues, much of the dialogues work on Nicaragua. And Manuel is here based in Washington and joins us this morning, so I thank him as well. After opening remarks from each speaker, I will ask a few follow-up questions before turning to our participants for their comments and questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as we possibly can. The participants can submit questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom or by emailing meetings@thedialogue.org. And with that introduction, let me start now by turning to Carlos Fernando in Costa Rica. If he could perhaps just give us a sense of the current situation in Nicaragua and what his view is of what Ortega is up to with this brazen crackdown. What is he trying to achieve? Why is this happening now? And where you see things headed? Will this continue, and to what end? So let me turn it over to Carlos Fernando to get us started this morning.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning to all my colleagues in the panel and the audience of the Inter-American Dialogue. It is a challenge attempt to understand the irrationality of the political logic of the Ortega Murillo dictatorship. People usually use the word madness, but there are several facts that give us a more clear projection of a cold calculation of power. First, there is the elimination of political competition on the November 7 election. We knew already that there would not be transparency or fairness. We knew that Ortega had approved those 4 laws last year to eliminate candidates, but we didn't know about the brutality in which these inhibitions will be implemented. I think it's quite clear that Ortega cannot take the risk of electoral competition, and even more, he cannot take the risk of political mobilization during an electoral campaign. And secondly, this is directly related with the first point, it is the elimination of political resistance, mobilization, and organizational capacity. At least 4 of the 6 precandidatos that have been in prison have had links with grassroots organizations with the protest of April 2018, but there are also some other 14 political or civic leaders that have been arrested. Third, I think there is a decision to maintain the police state as a permanent factor in Nicaraguan life. I'm talking about the normalization of violence, about the state of fear that has been imposed in Nicaragua. And as a journalist, this is my daily life. I have no sources in Nicaragua anymore, either business representatives, political sources, religious. No one is willing to talk. And this situation is imposing a situation of silence. I think also we are facing a radicalization of the political process. We have to see that Ortega is maintaining the market economy, business as usual, but he is giving some kind of a green light to his supporters to exercise political violence. I think things could get much worse in the next month as a response of the regime to whatever decisions are taken by the international community. This all looks very irrational, but Ortega is assuming that whatever political cost he pays, he will stay in power. He already paid the cost of the massacres of 2018, and all these crimes are in impunity. So no matter what international sanctions or pressures, as long as he can maintain control of the police, the army, his supporters, and the economy takes advantage of an increasing international demand, there is a calculation by Ortega that he can stay in power beyond November the 7th. I think he's taking advice. He's taking advice of the experience of Maduro in Venezuela. Maduro has lasted in power no matter what had been the reaction of the international community. And he, in one of his few public appearances, he said at the end of last year, or maybe the beginning of this year, that in 2022, there will be some kind of national dialogue, a kind of negotiation with the private sector, trying to rebuild the model of dialogue and cooperation that existed before 2018. That is Ortega's best world. And also to promote a negotiation with the leftovers of the political opposition under his own terms. Whether this is viable or not will depend on several factors: the reaction of the international community and the reaction of the Nicaraguan opposition, the business community, and the church in Nicaragua. I think it is important to analyze this crisis, not only thinking about what Ortega and Murillo are thinking or what are they deciding, but about the Sandinista elite or the Orteguista elite, this 400 people, including the generals of the army and the police, including the minister, the magistrates, the congressmen, the mayors, the Sandinista businessmen. Whatever they really think what Ortega is doing will maintain them in power with some kind of stability after in 2022. I mean, Ortega today is saying to the Nicaraguan community and the world that he is already in 2022. Is that viable? Will that lead to a stability? I have several serious doubts that will be possible, but that is my general consideration.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Carlos Fernando. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions and we can follow up on some of the important points that you made. But I think now perhaps we can turn to President Chinchillo. And now that we have a good sense of the situation and what may be driving, this terrible crackdown and human rights violations, the obvious question is what can be done? And we're at a point where we can assess what's been tried up until now in terms of sanctions from the US, in terms of the OAS resolution and statements from the EU and other measures. If this has been enough, and really, is there anything else that can and should be done? And President Chinchillo, you've been very, very vocal about this in a number of interviews. So why don't I turn the floor to you, and anxious to hear your perspective and your thoughts on this.
Well, thank you, Mike. First of all, I want to say that it's been an honor for me to support the brave people of Nicaragua in their fighting to attain democracy. We really appreciate the opportunity that the dialogue is giving us to bring the discussion to the dialogue. I know that the dialogue has been following the events and have also been defending the principles of democracy in Nicaragua. And in the rest of the hemisphere. It is so sad not having someone speaking at this forum in Nicaragua, because as Carlos Fernando said, they are all silenced. So just to have an idea, if someone participates in a forum like this, that person will be arrested immediately, because the only fact of speaking about what is happening in Nicaragua is criminalized. So that is the situation that we are having there. But the problem with this kind of rulers is that they have no scruples at all. Their only concern, and Carlos Fernando put it very well, is to accumulate absolute power, political and economic power, because they need both, of course. So they don't care if this means leading their peoples to extreme situations, giving way to economic and humanitarian crisis. Much less are they concerned on becoming international pariahs, because they don't care about international public opinion at all. So, of course, the international declarations condemning the regime are fine, but we must understand that they are not enough. So that is first. We have to go beyond all the condemnations that have been approved in the Organization of American States, at the European Parliament, like yesterday happened, and in many other forums. Those are okay, but we must go beyond. Having said this, I am not sure that if we will have time to change the course of events, because it is only 4 months before the national elections. Now, I see at this point three leverage points where the international community should focus the pressure in the months ahead, or in the weeks ahead. The first is the personal or family assets. We need to understand that what is governing Nicaragua is a family cartel. The Ortega Murillos has accumulated an immense fortune, is one of the richest families in Nicaragua. Most of that fortune came from the resources that entered into Nicaragua from PetroCaribe through the Albanesa company that was established since 2007, only to facilitate the illicit enrichment of Daniel and his family. For you to have an idea, the funds coming from PetroCaribe between 2010 2014 represented between 30% to 50% of the fiscal revenues in Nicaragua. So they have really amassed an impressive fortune. So although it is not easy to keep track of these resources, a concerted action by several countries to freeze those resources will inflict a severe blow to the Ortega Murillo family. So far, the measures have been taken only by the United States through the Treasury Department, but more countries should join this kind of actions. In this regard, the resolution approved yesterday by the European Union is a very positive step, because it also calls to ensure international financial security in the face of illicit operation originating from the Ortega Murillo regime. The second point is has to do with the resources coming from foreign international sources. Nicaragua's economy is not the Venezuela's economy. The Nicaragua's economy has been in crisis since the social outbreak of 2018. It has accumulated 4 years of negative growth. In order to survive, it largely depends on foreign trade and financing coming from US-based corporations and organizations. So Nicaragua's trade with the United States is very important. And also it is important the financing coming from the IDB, the World Bank, the IMF, and also the Central American Development Bank. If these two main sources of income, trade, and financial funds are affected through the application of the NICA Act and the issue of the renacer that was already approved by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, it will be more difficult for the Ortega Murillo to survive. And finally, I will say that we also should focus on the army. It has been a key player in supporting the regime. The Nicaragua army has also relied very heavily on the assistance provided by the United States Southern Command, which considered the army as an ally in the fight against drug trafficking. So it is time to eliminate all the backing they might be receiving from the United States Southern Command. And moreover, the same sanctions that I mentioned should be applied to the Ortega Murillo family must be applied to the high-rank members of the army. So I think, again, and just to finalize, that time is passing very fast, and we must go beyond the declarations and try to act very decisively on the family and those collaborators' assets, and also try to mobilize the international organizations to really affect the flow of resources to Nicaragua. I understand that this is a very tough decision because it will impact the Nicaraguan economy, but that decision has to be taken along with a coherent kind of diplomatic strategy, so we can really get a negotiation basically guaranteeing to set the conditions for free and fair elections for next November national elections. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, President Chinchilla. Very useful and very clear, and we'll certainly come back to some of those interesting proposals as well. Let me turn now to Manuel Orozco, who following obviously Nicaragua for forever, deeply concerned about the situation, and really is ask him a little bit about the migration question and the broader Central American issue, and how Nicaragua fits, whether what we're seeing in terms of Nicaraguans leaving the country, going either to the north or to Costa Rica has been the customary destination, but also other countries, and what the implications of that those movements are, and how they should be viewed within the broader sort of context and framework of Central America. So let me turn it to Manuel.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I'd like to echo the thanks from my colleagues for having this event at the dialogue. There are definitely, migration is perhaps one of four major consequences of this political crisis originated by the Nicaraguan regime. And I mean, the state of fear that Carlos talks about has a large spectrum from the inability of people to feel they can trust, they can speak freely with each other, to the actual fear and justifiable sense of persecution that people have, that they could be next to be beaten up or detained, either by the police or by Sandinista-led mobs. The sense of electoral loss in the population is perhaps one of the major consequences of all these political crises. Nicaraguans typically tend to vote on large numbers, and now they, even though they believe that if there was a free and fair election, the opposition will defeat the regime, the majority are convinced that there will be electoral fraud. and yet they still believe how important it will be to have an election with international observation. Economically, people are living basically on 2017 income levels, on 11,000 Cordobas on average, less than $260 a month per household. So conditions are really dire, and migration is another phenomenon. Just as a point of departure, in 2017, more or less, there were 650,000 Nicaraguans living abroad. Today, we're talking about 800,000. And that's putting a low figure. Just looking at the number of person-to-person, household-to-household transactions, we're talking about 730,000 transactions month-to-month going to households in Nicaragua, in a country of 1.6 million people. The intention to migrate increased in 2019 from 19% of people wanting to migrate, mostly for political reasons, to 35% in last April of 2021. The reasons given are a complex set of arguments, mostly similar to those that the other countries in the Northern Triangle are providing: economics, unemployment, but also the sense of loss in the political conditions in their country. In fact, the intention to migrate is more likely to increase among those who believe that there will be fraud in the election, but also that there are serious human rights violations in the country. So this is a really dire situation, in that there is a sense of frustration that the country is going in the wrong direction, and therefore their options are very much limited. You cannot, following Hirschman's exit, voice, and loyalty, the option of voice is practically nullified by the state. Accepting the status quo is basically accepting to live in a state of fear. So exit becomes a more reliable option for many people. I estimate that this year we may be talking about 100,000 Nicaraguans leaving the country. And this is one of the shifts in the trends that are taking place today. For example, only this year, there are at least 15,000 Nicaraguans who have moved north. In 2018, there were only, throughout the entire year, there were only 3,000 people detained at the US border trying to come into the United States. This number now is far higher. It may be 10 times higher by the end of 2021 than it was in 2018. And then this is one of the major changes that is taking place with regards to migration. People are actually looking up north. The migration trends to Costa Rica have remained pretty much the same, except that there is also an increase in irregular migration, people crossing over what is called the blind spots. I was in Costa Rica last week through the border of Los Chiles and Upala, for example, where you see pockets of groups of people of 10 crossing the border on a regular basis. And they're coming practically empty-handed, with a lot of fear for their lives, but also with a sense of frustration of, what can they do? A search for guidance in terms of how to deal with the current political situation. The number of Nicaraguans coming to Costa Rica might be at least 3,000 every year for the next rest of the 2021 period. So we're talking about a large mass of people getting out of Nicaragua, going to Costa Rica, to Panama, and more recently to the United States. But in large numbers, they're following the Northern Triangle route. And so the question is, how do you deal with this problem at this point in time? I think the most important issue is, again, looking at the political situation in Nicaragua and addressing it from various diplomatic angles. From the US Congress, as President Chinchilla mentioned, it's important to use the NICA Act, which is actually an important legislation that could deal with the funding that the International Monetary Fund has given to Nicaragua in the amount of more than $180 million to at least suspend the financing until Nicaragua addresses the issues of human rights violations and violations of constitutional rights. There is also the important element of the Renacer Act, which can take a look at number of issues and that it could be at this point approved as soon as possible. Other issues is to hold hearings at the state with the State Department as well as with the Lantos commissions over a clear definition of the extent of human rights violations in the country, not only in terms of the 27 political activists jailed, but also the state of fear that has instilled. This meeting alone has been the subject of discussion this morning by the Nicaraguan Sandinista radio stations, accusing to basically to say that this is a CIA operative activity. So the extent to which this is happening is very worrisome for most Nicaraguans. In addition to that, I think from a cooperation perspective, it's important to continue offering some support to Nicaragua and to the Nicaraguan people, revisit the strategy of US cooperation to Nicaragua from a different lens, more of a country that is a fragile state, a repressive regime, as is approached to countries like Cuba, Afghanistan, Syria, among others, with a different type of perspective on how to deal with this type of difficult regimes. In addition to that, it's important to pay attention to Nicaraguan migrants having a sense of humanitarian assistance, but also look at the same approach, the Northern Triangle +1 approach that includes a type of integration, economic integration of Nicaraguans, for example, in Costa Rica, at a point in time when the Costa Rican economy is struggling to handle the number of immigrants that are coming into that country. So there are a number of options available to address and tackle with this problem. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Manuel. That was great and great issues, and we'll come back to a number of them, I'm sure. We have about 300 people on the line, and we've gotten a lot of good questions, but let me just go quickly, maybe a follow-up at least to Carlos Fernando. And first of all, I want to, I stand corrected, and I'm glad that Maria Andrea Chamorro is keeping me honest, which she should, and to remind everybody that it's not just Cristiana Chamorro, but also Carlos Fernando's brother, Pedro Joaquin Chamorro. Both of them are being arbitrarily detained. So I did have that in my notes, but I didn't mention it. I want to mention it now. But Carlos Fernando, I guess there are really two questions, and you can comment as you like. I guess really the first question, which is the obvious one, which is you've heard President Chinchilla, you've heard Manuel with some ideas of what should be done, and would be curious to get your perspective on those ideas and how effective do you think they would be, how the regime would respond. Would this be helpful? Would these ideas be helpful? What do you think of, the different leverage points that we've heard from President Chinchilla and Manuel? And the second that I have is if you could just tell a little bit more about, or you talk about Ortega's supporters. Who are these supporters? How large is his support in Nicaragua? Are we talking about 10% of the population or 20% of the population? Who are they exactly? How do they benefit from the regime? If you can give us a little bit of sort of insight into his base of support and how they are, and how extensive it is, and why they are sustaining the regime.
I think given the current crisis, there is a need that the international community, through the OAS and the European Union and US government and others, declared, not November the 7th or after, but right now, that these elections are dead. I mean, the elections on November the 7th are not competitive elections. And it should be made very clear that the government that will be elected, I mean, the Ortega government, will not have international recognition by which countries, I don't know. But for me, that's the first important point. The first political point is to make that clear. Nicaragua, if there is a humanitarian crisis, will require urgently the presence of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, of the United Nations human rights commissions in order to face this problem. There will not be electoral solution unless the state of siege, the police state, is lifted in Nicaragua. That will not be possible under Ortega. It might be possible later, after a combination of several pressures. But regarding what Manuel and Laura said, I think it's very important to focus on the economic pillars of the regime. And there are two very important ones. One is the Central American Integration Bank, the BESIE, and the other one is the Inter-American Development Bank, the BID. The two of them are somehow related with the decisions that the OAS has to decide. I think the Ortega's assets, that's very important, but the most important thing is what is the impact of the economic pressure on the way in which the government is working internally, precisely because that is what gives them the capacity to give the hope to their supporters that they will still be there, that they will have the capacity not only to pay the payroll every month, even in advance, but also to offer them some hope of the future. Ortega supporters are a very strong political minority, probably 1/3 of the electorate, and it goes up and down. I mean, and I think he has been able to recover part of those supports, no matter what had been the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. These supporters are in different sectors of society, not only the poor, but also the middle class that has been gained leverage and access to different services and in business capacity with the Ortega regime. So there is some kind of economic sustainability of the regime, which is based on the support of their political supporters. And I think it's very important to understand that. And so what I'm trying to say is, unless those who are surrounding Ortega really visualize that there is no future, that there is no 2022 or 2023 in the current situation, it will be very difficult to remove them from supporting Ortega. So we need a combination of political and economic pressures in order to work in that direction.
Great, thank you very much. President Chinchilla, you alluded to this at the end of your comments, but I was hoping maybe you can address this more directly and maybe elaborate a little bit more. That when people propose the kind of measures that you outline, the reaction is always, well, this is going to hurt the Nicaraguan people, and that these kind of very tough, harsh measures, are not going to sway the regime, and in fact, they're going to be counterproductive. And of course, this is an argument, as we know, that we hear a lot when these measures are discussed in the context of Venezuela and other countries. And so I'm just wondering if you can kind of elaborate why you think these will, these will work and won't hurt, or perhaps some cost is, in terms of the economics of most Venezuelans is justified in terms of the larger objective of addressing the human rights and democracy issues.
Yes, Mike, I perfectly understand how careful we should be when we recommend the use of economic sanctions. I am perfectly, conscious about that. And if we use the example of Venezuela, probably it is not the right one, because in the case of Venezuela, there was never a coherent diplomatic strategy. So they only put economic sanctions, and there were no, diplomatic strategy at all. One day they said that, all the scenarios were on the table. The other day they were trying to negotiate with, informal kind of armed groups. And the other day they were talking about negotiations. but never very seriously. In this occasion, I think the situation could be more promising in terms of accompanying the economic sanctions with an international front pressing the regime for a negotiated transition in order to have the fair and free elections we are looking for. Something that really give me hopes that this diplomatic strategy can be also in place is that, different from what happened with the Venezuela situation, the Ortega regime is isolated. Every day is more isolated. Look at the votes that we got at the Organization of American States. Only 2 countries supported Daniel Ortega. And yesterday, the voting at the European Parliament was also really impressive against the Nicaragua regime. So I think there are conditions to bring those sanctions along with a diplomatic strategy. And finally, let me to underline two other issues. The first is that, as Carlos Fernando already explained, this kind of regime relied on large amounts of patronage. If such clientelist scheme falls due to the lack of resources coming from international sources, the regime will weaken from its foundation. And we need to do that very urgently because they are using those resources for political purposes for the next elections. And finally, the people in Nicaragua are already suffering. Look at the numbers that Manuel already gave. People are fleeing the country. So they are already suffering. There is already a new humanitarian crisis coming in our hemisphere after the Venezuelan one, and that is the Nicaraguan crisis. If we want to prevent this, we must act right now.
Great, thank you. Just there's a question from Patricia Garib, just to follow up, President Chinchilla, about NAFTA, I'm sorry, CAFTA DR, and whether the idea of using that and suspending Nicaragua from that would be useful. Do you have any thoughts about CAFTA?
You are asking me, Mike?
Yes, if that would be one of the
yes.
Things you'd propose.
Something similar happened yesterday when the European Parliament calls for using the association agreement that the Central America negotiated with Europe. That was when I was president, by the way. And both in the CAFTA and also in the association agreement with the European Union, we can find the right kind of norms that allows those other governments, the United States and the European governments, to use those norms or those clauses to punish the Nicaraguan government in terms of trade, for example, in terms of investments, because those two agreements, CAFTA and the association agreement, they are not only concerned about trade and investment, they are also concerned about the respect for human rights and the respect for democracy. So I think, and that is something I also want to underline in this discussion, there are already the instruments, there are the international instruments. We have the Democratic Charter at the Organization of American States, we have the NICA Act in the United States, we have CAFTA, and we have the association agreement with Europe. What we need right now is to implement those instruments, to go beyond the words and to act accordingly to those principles that were enacted in those instruments.
Great, thank you. Let me turn to Manuel, and I have 3 questions for you, Manuel. One is really my question, which is if you can, I'd like to hear your perspective on whether you think there's any possibility of having We're now in July, and if there's any possibility still of having free and fair vote elections in November. And then the other two questions are one here taking from participant, which is directed to you, from Jessica Bolter, who asked, why do you think more Nicaraguan migrants are coming to the US border? Are these people who might have gone to Costa Rica but are choosing the US instead, or are they a different slice of the population of Nicaragua? And the third question comes from Kim Stanton, who asks, what are the role of the Central American governments playing in dealing with this crisis, and how do you explain the positions that they're taking regarding Nicaragua? It'd be good to have your thoughts on those, if possible.
Thanks, Michael. Yes, let me just remind, and following a little bit on Laura's point of CAFTA and international pressure. The purpose of international pressure is aimed at restoring the balance of power between the forces of democratic and economic stability in Nicaragua. This is a fundamental issue to understand. And CAFTA falls into this framework to some extent. There are consequences to it, of course. There may even be consequences that actually suspending Nicaragua from CAFTA can actually increase the revenue of the Nicaraguan state because of the tariffs that will be imposed on exports and imports of American goods. So, the whole purpose of looking at international pressure, economic and political, is to identify what are the most precise elements and instruments that you can utilize to really restore this balance of power. There is no intention here to remove a government for the sake of removing it, but to have a competitive process. And that's the real problem. There is no competitive process available at this point in time. It is highly unlikely that you can have free and fair elections in November 2019. The only way that this can happen is that if the international community restores this balance of power, and at least three minimum conditions are met. One is that international observation takes place. Two is that the Nicaraguans are protected for voting and their vote is defended. And there are ways to do that, even negotiating with the Nicaraguan government to have perhaps the Nicaraguan army rather than the police to defending. Three is to allow for some level of political proselytism, starting by releasing the prisoners that are right now basically kidnapped by the state. There is no due process taking place at this point in time on those individuals detained. So there are no conditions. The elimination of all the political parties at this point has basically left one political party without a reliable and legitimate and representative candidate that you could think that Nicaraguans will think of. At the same time, the state of fear has created so much apathy and fear itself that people would likely not go to vote because they're afraid that something can happen to them because of the level of intimidation that exists at this point. On the second question on migration, I think Nicaraguans, migration is based, one of the foundations of international migration in the 21st century is transnational networks. And before you migrate, you have an idea of where you can go, what are your chances of getting a job on the other side, and what is your support network, your transnational social capital. And Nicaraguans are aware that the current economic conditions in Costa Rica are such that the carrying capacity of so many migrants is not allowing to absorb them into the labor force in the Costa Rican economy. So that's one factor that is making it difficult. People are still migrating to Costa Rica, but the growth of migration to Costa Rica is going to be pretty much the same as it was in 2019. Now, the other factor that people are going north is because there is a learning curve on looking at how the migratory networks have taken place from the other neighboring countries from Central America. They understand the processes, the vehicles that exist, as well as the transnational ties. Let's remember that 40% of Nicaraguans living abroad are in the United States. There are over 300,000 Nicaraguans in the United States out of 800,000 perhaps at this point in time. 70,000 in Spain, about 50,000 in Panama. And so the transnational family ties are being activated to bring your relatives as quickly as possible, given the circumstances. And on the third, the role of Central America, this is basically the tiebreakers. Central America really has the fundamental breaking point about the political conditions in Nicaragua, because the pressure of the Central American countries has a direct effect on the decisions that the Nicaraguan government makes. And there is one country that has been reluctant to support any political resolution from the OAS, from the Inter-American system, Central American integration system, to deal with Nicaragua, and that's Honduras, partly because of the fear of President Hernandez that he may be investigated and tried in the United States, therefore keeping an alternative address in Nicaragua, just as Mauricio Funes did in El Salvador, going to Nicaragua. So the role of Honduras is really important to put pressure on Nicaragua from the Central American governments. It's important for the Central American Bank of Economic Integration. 10% of Nicaragua's budget comes from foreign assistance, from external indebtedness. And that's about $200 million every year, more or less, since the crisis to some extent. And that funding comes predominantly from CABEI, from the IDB, from the IMF, and it's taking place just at the time that is basically oxygenating the repressive apparatus. And this is where the critical issue of international pressure is important, because it's not that you are acting against humanitarian assistance, it's that you are acting against the repressive nature of the state that is using funding to oxygenate the repressive nature of the state, but also the clientelistic networks that it maintains in its operations.
Great, thanks. I'd like to get President Chinchilla's view on the Central America. And of course, we have a question here from Mohammed Sheikh, who asks very directly, why is BCIE still giving loans to Nicaragua? But I'd like to get President Chinchilla's take on the Central American, the position the Central American governments are taking, and and what role could the region play in the Nicaraguan crisis, and should play?
Sure, Mike. The impact of this crisis on Central America, it's extremely complex and negative, considering that the region is going through probably the worst situation since the years of the civil wars. Beyond the most obvious impact, which Manuel already mentioned, and that is migration, there are also economic impacts and political implications. In terms of the economic impacts, let's remember that the economies of Central America are highly integrated. The Central America Common Market represents more than 20% of the region's commercial activity. And when a country is affected by some kind of crisis, the other also receive the impact. In this case, for example, we are already again talking in Central America about how to avoid using the Nicaraguan territory in case that the frontiers are going to be closed, or if it is impossible to use these streets to cross to the Central American, to connect the Central American economies ahead. So that is something important. And also remember that due to the impact of the pandemic and the impact of the climate events that took place last year, the Central American economies have the urgency to implement recovery economic strategies. And the third one is the political implications, because if Daniel is reelected in some rigged elections, this will generate incentives for other rulers in Central America and beyond to follow the same route, the same path of autocracy and dictatorship. Now, as also Manuel mentioned, the Central American countries in general have been dragging their feet on the Nicaraguan issue. I want to be very sincere. I was expecting a more active role because they are saying nothing when, for example, the Central America Integration Bank, the BCE, approved an important loan just 2 weeks ago. So it was important to look that the declaration that was approved by the European Parliament yesterday, it has a call to the Central American countries to react in front of the Nicaraguan situation. So again, there are implications, but we need a more proactive attitude coming from the governments. And I think that probably the pressures will increase in the following days to get a different attitude coming from the Central American governments in face of the Nicaraguan situation.
Great, thank you very much, President Xi. I have two questions for Carlos Fernando Chamorro, going back to you. The first is from our friend, Rose Spalding, political scientist, I believe you know, who studied in Nicaragua for many years. She asked Carlos Fernando, why did Ortega regime detain Jose Adan Aguirre? This has to be economically costly to the regime, given Aguirre's long leadership of COSEP. If you can kind of shed light on that. And the second question I want to ask you comes from Jennifer McCoy of the Carter Center, who basically is exploring, is there any thought given to the issue and the topic of transitional justice in the Nicaraguan case that would basically provide some assurances of protections to elite groups that are tied to the Ortega Murillo regime? Would there be any guarantees to them that would assure them of their freedom and finances that would perhaps motivate or incentivize the regime to negotiate competitive elections? So is that at all an issue in the Nicaraguan situation?
Regarding the detention of Jose Adan Aguirre, I would say my question would be more on why the private sector have not really reacted to that detention and to the detention of Luis Rivas Anduray, the president of Banpro. I mean, all the wave of repression, and I'm talking about starting with the detention of my sister, Cristiana Chamorro, Arturo Cruz, Juan Sebastián Chamorro, Felix Maradiaga, others, and now Jose Adan Aguirre, Luis Rivas, my brother, Pedro Joaquín Chamorro, has been unpredictable in the sense that it really goes beyond what people expected in terms of eliminating political competition. There is a message to the private sector. Jose Adan Aguirre had been, yes, a former president of COSEP, but also he's been very active in the Civic Alliance, participating in promoting, let's say, political rights. Now, the private sector has not really reacted in a proportion to what that means. And I think that's the real question that I ask them. I mean, what are you waiting for to start to put the limits to the Ortega repressive regime? Yes, there are risks. Yes, but on the other hand, I think they do have a responsibility, because Ortega is still counting on that they will accept the rules of the game that he had in the past before 2018. I think they do have a leverage, the private sector, to exercise more pressure to the Ortega regime. Everybody is afraid. Nobody wants to say a word. But I think both Nicaraguan private sector and regional private sector, I'm talking about the Mexican business community, the Colombians, the Central American one, they do have an important stake in this crisis to put pressure. Regarding transitional justice, there have been different opinions on this issue in the past. I don't think there have been any serious discussion about that. I think in the heart of the Nicaraguan society, there is a demand that this time there should not be amnesty, that there should not be impunity, that there is a need to reconstruct the country on the base of justice, which is based on the truth. Now, that doesn't mean vengeance, but it really means rebuilding the institutional capacity of the country in order to have justice for the future. That is bad news for Ortega Murillo and their small group of supporters involved in corruption and involved in crimes. But I don't see any possibility of rebuilding Nicaragua. I'm not saying this will happen now. I said before, the November the 7th election, for me, and I believe for many Nicaraguans, are dead. I mean, you cannot participate in those elections with 6 pre-candidates in prison and 26 electoral hostages. I don't think people do really have any trust in participating in this process, but they're looking for the future. I mean, and in the middle run, I think there will be a political change. Now, that political change will have to require an understanding of the need to face the question of justice. I don't think anybody can give the Ortega Murillo clan any kind of hope for impunity or this kind of negotiation. I cannot think about rebuilding Nicaragua without the basis of truth, justice, and no impunity.
Great, thank you. Manuel, back to you. If a question, you've studied more than anybody the role of diasporas, and we do have a question from Ramses Omar Cabrales, who asks, what concrete steps can the Nicaraguan diaspora in the US take to positively influence the situation in the short and medium term in Nicaragua? Do you see any role?
Yeah, there are plenty. I think the diaspora it has become an important political actor in the international scene that can rely on the 3 main sources of international pressure, condemnation, intermediation, and sanctions of different form. And I think the Nicaraguan diaspora has been organizing itself in different groups through different forums to increase not only their outreach to, for example, US Congress, to the Costa Rican legislators and the Costa Rican government, as well as the US government, the Canadian government, among others. The influence of several diaspora organizations on the OAS has also been very important in this whole process. There are other areas where the diaspora can play an important role, and it's in the economic front. They have been really one of the most important lifelines of economic growth in Nicaragua. The remittances were basically the only source of the positive economic growth in Nicaragua during this whole past 3 years since 2018 political crisis. The diaspora, once organized in a better fashion, can actually exert more function in translating the role and the relationships through family networks on how to deal with their expenditures, for example, how to manage their funds without touching government resources. So there are different areas of intervention in that regard. They can also play an important role, I think, of still knocking into the government's door. It's important to continue knocking into the door, into the dissident forces, for example, to establish an engagement and restore the political conditions in Nicaragua in a more positive way. One cannot simply go in the direction of putting pressure to get the regime to comply, but also to intermediate with them, to make sense of the damage that the government is doing moving forward to all of Nicaraguans. And the diaspora plays an important role in that because the diaspora cares about their homeland. And so they have been playing an important economic role into this and can commit to really improve economic growth in the country, provided that the regime really does better. starting, for example, in restoring the right to vote. Nicaraguans do not have the right to vote, even though it's actually legally provided by two laws in the country.
Great, thank you. We're reaching the end of our time. I just want to give maybe a final question for President Chinchilla, or maybe two questions that's possible. The first really is on Roberto Flores Bermudez asks about the opinion of the role and increasing presence of China in the region and what role that can play concerning Nicaragua. And I think maybe to add to that, the role of Russia, as well as being a strong supporter of the Ortega regime. How do you perceive that? And the second question, conclude on this, is from Santiago Canton, who says that over the last decades, the OAS and the inter-American system have not been very effective in resolving many of the democratic crises in Latin America, and an obstacle has been the ideological divide and polarization in the region. The question is, do you think that this will also is this also the obstacle to address the Nicaraguan crisis, or because of the brutality and the reprehensible extreme nature of the repression as denounced by the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, is there any chance that the region might be more united than in other situations?
Yes, of course. I don't see China playing this kind of destabilizing role in Nicaragua. China has become an important option for trade and investment for our countries. We have to be very sincere about that. And during these last days of the COVID-19 pandemic, they have used, in certain way, the vaccines to strengthen their diplomatic presence in the region, basically in El Salvador, for example. But I don't see China as a problem, at least in the case of Nicaragua. But I see Russia as an issue. And so it is important to have this in mind, because I think this is a task mostly for the United States government, the role of Russia, the role that Russia is playing in Nicaragua. It should be considered as part of the diplomatic strategy, especially because Russia has been supporting the Nicaragua military through different kind of support, aid, training, and so on. And very clear, they want to have a role in this situation. So I think that that has to be part of the strategy implemented by the United States within a diplomatic kind of view. Now, considering the OAS, it is very critical to have Latin America united behind this situation. And I think that it is still possible to get some actions at the OAS. First, because again, this is not Venezuela. And when you look at the last resolution that was approved at the OAS, Nicaragua only obtained 2 votes in his favor. Secondly, because very recently, important personalities from the left in Latin America signed a declaration denouncing the abuses of the Ortega regime. And I think that that was a very clear message for 2 governments in the region who could play a more active role. They are Argentina and Mexico. So I think there is a space to get something different from those governments and to move on at the Organization of American States. In my opinion, it is time to use the Inter-American Charter and to approve and vote in favor of sanctions against Nicaragua at the OAS. I think that is the next step, and it should be at this point being part of the following step.
Great. Thank you very much, President Chia. I want to, we've kind of reached the end of our time. I think this has been extraordinarily rich discussion, useful discussion on a very, very profoundly troubling situation. And I think all of us shared the sense that this is what's going on is just reprehensible and indefensible. All of us are hoping for the best outcome, and we express certainly on my part in the dialogue and everybody, I think, on this call this morning, total solidarity with all of those that who have been persecuted, who are now being arbitrarily detained, including, as I mentioned before, many good friends, many who have been very close to the Inter-American dialogue and close to many of us personally for many, many years. Should have mentioned also that in addition to Carlos Fernando's sister and brother who are being arbitrarily detained, Carlos Fernando's mother, Doña Violeta Chamorro, has been a dialogue member for many, many years, and certainly has been extremely close to this organization. So I think a lot of good ideas have come out in this session. At the end of the day, it really depends on the will and the commitment of those in a position to act. And I think, as many of you said, to implement the measures and instruments. There are instruments that are in place; they're just not being used. And I think that hopefully unfortunately, sometimes it takes a terrible crisis to force action. And we're certainly beyond that point in the case of Nicaragua, and we hope that there'll be effective action taken to try to deal with the tremendous deterioration in the human rights situation, democracy situation in the country. So I want to thank again our great speakers and Carlos Fernando and total solidarity and a real salute to your continued bravery and the valuable work that you continue to do. President Chinchilla, thank you again for joining us from New York and for your extremely public and outspoken and critical role in the dealing with this crisis, and to have you as a leading Latin American figure, former president, I think is extremely important and valuable. And Muel, as always, thank you to you for your incredible work and valuable information and perspective on the Nicaraguan situation, and of course for all of you've done with the dialogue, working together with the dialogue, and to thank you in particular for helping put together and organizing this event. I also want to thank my colleagues at the dialogue, Gaston Ocampo and Irene Estefania, for all of their logistical work, administrative work, and making this possible, coordinating this session. And of course, to the 300 or so participants who joined the conversation this morning. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions, but we tried to get to as many of them as possible, and really appreciate your interest and for asking good questions. So thanks to all, and just to learn more about dialogue events, and we'll continue to have events on Nicaragua and on other critical challenges in the region. I encourage you to consult the dialogue.org/events, and you can see more about our events that are coming up. So we'll hope that you'll continue to be engaged in our work. There are many important issues out there, and we're going to continue to try to shed light on them and to try to come up with practical, realistic solutions that move in a positive direction. So thank you all very much, and please just stay well and take good care, and we'll continue to be